One of the first things you must understand when dealing with toxic people is that your greatest mistake may be believing you can change them. You see their destructive behavior, you recognize the insecurity behind it, the need for control, the constant criticism, the manipulation, and you think, if I explain myself clearly enough, perhaps they will understand. But this is where many intelligent people become trapped. They assume that reason automatically produces self-awareness. It does not. A person who is committed to misunderstanding you can turn even your best explanation into another opportunity. You apologize for something you did not even do, and suddenly they expect another apology. The conversation never reaches resolution, because resolution was never the real objective. The real objective may be control. This is why you have to stop looking at toxic behavior as a problem you are responsible for solving. Your responsibility is not to rehabilitate every difficult person who enters your life. Your responsibility is to understand what you are dealing with and decide how much access that person deserves. Think about this carefully. When you repeatedly try to change someone, you place your emotional stability in their hands. Your peace becomes dependent on whether they behave differently tomorrow. Your confidence depends on whether they finally recognize your value, and without realizing it, you have allowed another person to become the manager of your emotional life. That is a dangerous position. The smarter approach is observation rather than obsession. Watch patterns. What happens when you disagree with them? How do they respond when you establish a boundary? Do they take responsibility, or do they immediately search for someone to blame? Do they respect your independence, or do they become threatened when you stop giving them? You may remember the good moments and convince yourself that the relationship can return to what it once was. But potential is not the same thing as character. You must judge people by what they consistently do, not by who you hope they will become. This does not mean becoming cold or cruel. It means becoming psychologically disciplined. You can understand someone without excusing them. You can have compassion without giving them back into the same position of influence. And this is where your power begins. Instead of asking, "How do I make this person change?" ask a more intelligent question in this dynamic. Maybe you stop explaining yourself. Maybe you stop responding immediately. Maybe you share less. Maybe you create distance. Maybe you simply decide that their opinion no longer deserves the authority you once gave it. You cannot control another person's character, but you can control your access, your attention, and your response. And sometimes the smartest way to deal with a toxic person is not to defeat them, it is to stop giving them the opportunity to disturb your peace. Once you stop trying to change toxic people, the next lesson becomes even more important. They think the conflict is about what the other person said or did, but beneath the surface, the real struggle is often about who controls the emotional atmosphere of the interaction. A toxic person may provoke you with an insult, question your intelligence, dismiss your achievements, or deliberately misunderstand your intentions. Your instinct is to defend yourself immediately. You want to prove them wrong. You want them to understand what they have done. But the moment you react impulsively, you have entered their psychological arena. They have discovered the buttons they can push, and every emotional reaction teaches them where those buttons are located. This is why emotional discipline is not weakness. It is a form of power. The person who remains calm when everyone else becomes emotional has an enormous strategic advantage. They can observe while others react. They can think while others speak impulsively. They can choose their response instead of being forced into one. Imagine someone says something deliberately disrespectful to you. Your first instinct may be to answer with something even harsher. Suddenly, the original issue has disappeared, replaced by a battle of egos, and this is exactly where toxic dynamics thrive. They pull you into emotional chaos, and then they use your reaction as evidence against you. Look how angry you are. Look how unreasonable you are. The original provocation becomes irrelevant. Now you are defending your reaction instead of examining their behavior. The wiser response is often a pause. Not every accusation requires an answer. Not every insult deserves a defense. There is a difference between emotional control and emotional suppression. Suppression means you feel anger but have no way to process it. Control means you recognize the emotion, understand where it comes from, and refuse to let it make your decisions for you. You can be firm without being explosive. You can say, "I don't accept being spoken to that way," without turning the moment into a war. You can walk away without announcing your departure dramatically. You can disagree without needing to destroy the other person's dignity. If they can make you desperate for their approval, they have influence over you. If they can make you abandon your principles simply because they are provoking you, they have influence over you. Your goal is not to become emotionless. Your goal is to become difficult to manipulate, because the moment you stop reacting automatically, the entire dynamic begins to change. Your calm becomes a boundary, your silence becomes information, your self-control becomes protection, and when someone can no longer control your emotions, they can no longer easily control you. And once you have learned to control your emotional reactions, you reach the next level of dealing with toxic people, learning to establish boundaries without constantly explaining yourself. This is where many people make a subtle mistake. They believe a boundary becomes legitimate only when the other person understands and agrees with it. So they begin explaining. They explain why the behavior hurt them, why they need distance, why they cannot accept certain treatment, why they deserve respect, and then they wait for permission. Consider what happens when you repeatedly explain a boundary to someone who benefits from crossing it. Your explanation becomes material they can argue with. You say, "I need some space," and they demand to know why. You explain, and they challenge your reasoning. You provide another explanation, and they find another objection. Eventually, you are no longer establishing a boundary. You are defending yourself in court. And toxic dynamics often survive precisely because the healthier person keeps trying to win that argument. You do not need to convince someone that your boundary is reasonable before enforcing it. If someone repeatedly insults you, you can end the conversation. If someone constantly invades your privacy, you can share less information. If someone repeatedly creates chaos, you can reduce your involvement. The consequence does not need to be dramatic. It simply needs to be consistent. This is an important psychological principle. People learn what they can get away with through repeated experience. If someone crosses a line and nothing changes, the line was never really a boundary, it was merely a request. And you end conversations when disrespect begins. You protect information that could later be used against you. Your actions communicate what your words cannot. There is also a deeper philosophical lesson here. Boundaries are not primarily about controlling other people. They are about governing yourself. You cannot force someone to respect you. You can only decide what you will do when they do not. That distinction changes everything. If you tell someone you must stop treating me this way, you have reclaimed control over your own life. And notice how different this feels. You are no longer waiting for their transformation. You are no longer dependent on their apology. You are no longer measuring your strength by whether you can force them to behave properly. You are simply choosing your response. Of course, boundaries should not become an excuse for cruelty, arrogance, or isolation. Mature boundaries are clear rather than vindictive. Their purpose is protection, not punishment. The goal is not to make toxic people suffer. The goal is to make sure their behavior no longer determines the quality of your life. Because a boundary that you refuse to enforce is only a suggestion. Once you begin establishing boundaries, another skill becomes essential: learning to recognize manipulation before you become emotionally trapped inside it. Because toxic behavior is not always obvious. Sometimes it does not arrive as an open attack. It can appear as concern, affection, disappointment, humor, or even vulnerability. A manipulative person may rarely tell you directly what they want. Everyone has bad days. Everyone can become defensive, selfish, or impatient. What matters is repetition. Does the same behavior appear whenever they do not get what they want? Do they repeatedly turn themselves into the victim whenever you raise a legitimate concern? Do they make you feel guilty for having normal needs? Do they distort conversations until you begin questioning what actually happened? Patterns reveal intention more clearly than promises. One common form of manipulation is guilt. Someone makes you feel selfish for saying no. They remind you of everything they have supposedly done for you. Slowly, you begin making decisions, not because you genuinely want to, but because you are afraid of being seen as a bad person. Another form is constant criticism disguised as honesty. They tell you, "I'm only trying to help," while repeatedly attacking your confidence. They point out your weaknesses but rarely acknowledge their own. Over time, you begin seeking their approval, and that is where the psychological trap becomes powerful. The person who constantly judges you gradually becomes the person whose approval you desperately want. Then, there is the victim strategy. You entered the conversation to discuss something they did, and somehow you leave apologizing for bringing it up. This is why emotional awareness must be combined with intellectual distance. Ask yourself, what happened immediately before this person changed the subject? What do they gain when I feel guilty? Why do I feel pressured to defend myself? Why does every disagreement somehow end with me questioning my own judgment? These questions interrupt manipulation because they move you from emotional participation into observation. Perhaps every conversation leaves you exhausted. Perhaps you consistently feel guilty after asserting yourself. Perhaps you notice that they are charming when they need something and hostile when you refuse. These are not random incidents if they keep repeating. You do not need to diagnose someone. You do not need to label them with a psychological disorder. You simply need enough awareness to recognize that a particular dynamic is unhealthy for you. That distinction matters. So pay attention to patterns. Watch what happens when you say no. Watch what happens when you disagree. Watch what happens when you stop providing attention. Because people reveal themselves most clearly when they no longer get what they want. And once you can see the pattern without being consumed by it, you have already taken away much of its power. Once you can recognize the pattern, the next question becomes, what do you actually do with that knowledge? And this is where many people make another mistake. They believe that if someone has treated them badly, they must confront that person, expose them, or somehow make them understand the damage they have caused. But confrontation is not always strength. Sometimes it is simply another invitation to continue the conflict. There are situations where the smartest response is distance. Distance is powerful because it removes the toxic person from the environment in which they have influence over you. If someone repeatedly creates drama, you do not have to attend every argument. If they constantly demand your attention, you do not have to remain constantly available. If they use personal information against you, you can become more selective about what you reveal. If you continually spend that currency on a person who produces nothing but conflict, eventually you become psychologically impoverished. The intelligent person learns to invest attention where it produces growth. This is why quiet withdrawal can sometimes accomplish what 100 arguments cannot. When you stop reacting, the cycle loses momentum. When you stop explaining, there is less material to manipulate. When you stop trying to obtain their approval, their ability to influence your self-esteem begins to disappear. Yet sometimes the desire for a dramatic ending is itself evidence that you are still emotionally attached to the conflict. You do not need the perfect final speech. You need a different pattern of behavior. Reduce access. Protect your private information. Limit unnecessary communication. Keep interactions focused when contact is unavoidable. Do not volunteer emotional details to someone who has repeatedly demonstrated that they cannot handle them responsibly. And notice the fill. Of course, not every difficult person should simply be abandoned. Some relationships require patience, communication, and repair. Family, professional responsibilities, and important commitments can make complete separation impossible. In those situations, strategic distance may mean emotional distance rather than physical disappearance. You can remain civil without remaining vulnerable. You can cooperate without becoming personally entangled. This is maturity. The goal is not to create enemies everywhere you go. The goal is to stop turning every difficult relationship into a battle for your peace. Sometimes you win, and sometimes you win by quietly becoming unavailable to the behavior that once consumed you. Do not confuse distance with weakness. A person who walks away from unnecessary conflict is not necessarily afraid of confrontation. They may simply understand that their time, attention, and emotional energy have greater value elsewhere. You do not have to destroy someone to remove their influence from your life. You only have to stop giving them access to the parts of you they keep damaging. And sometimes the most powerful exit is the one that requires no announcement at all. Because if you have learned to stop trying to change toxic people, control your emotional reactions, establish boundaries, recognize manipulation, and create distance when necessary, you have reached a point where the focus is no longer on them. It is on you. This is the real transformation. A toxic person only has as much psychological, and when someone deliberately withholds those things, we become tempted to chase them. We explain more, we defend ourselves more, we try harder to prove our worth. And ironically, the more desperately we seek validation from someone who refuses to give it, the more power we hand them. At some point, you have to ask yourself a difficult question. Why does this person's opinion have such authority over me? Maybe they criticize you. Let them. Maybe they refuse to acknowledge your value. Let them. You stop trying to control the perception of others and start controlling the quality of your own character. You become less interested in winning arguments and more interested in maintaining your principles, less interested in proving yourself and more interested in improving yourself, less interested in revenge and more interested in freedom. That is a profound psychological shift. Revenge keeps you connected to the person who harmed you. You continue thinking about them. Freedom means their behavior no longer determines the direction of your life. You do not need them to apologize before you move forward. You do not need them to understand before you find peace. You do not need them to admit they were wrong before you stop carrying the conflict inside your mind. You simply decide that their behavior will not become your identity. And this is where emotional discipline becomes a form of independence. You can hear criticism without collapsing. Not the ability to dominate another person, but the ability to remain governed by your own values when another person is trying to pull you into chaos. So when you encounter toxicity, remember what the real victory looks like. It is not making them afraid of you. It is not making them regret losing you. It is not proving that you were right. The real victory is reaching a point where you no longer need anything from them to feel whole. Protect your attention, protect your boundaries, protect your character. The ultimate power is not controlling toxic people. It is becoming impossible for their toxicity to control you.